All aboard! Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, football fans of all ages, I am Beast Mikey. You've now arrived in my train of thought. So I'm going to do this a little differently than what I've done in years past. Instead of doing the late games on Tuesdays, the early games on Mondays, I'm going to try to do all 16 all at once and then drop them on Tuesdays. Think of this as each week's railroad path through the 2024 NFL season. Our first stop is Kansas City, where the Chiefs obviously rose their third banner in 5 years. They have affirmed their dynasty, and they came out swinging and scored to start the season. Baltimore responded in kind very nicely. Derrick Henry looked good. Lamar Jackson looked great all night long. And then I think we all started to realize Buffalo, for the second time in 8 years, may have doomed us all. How do you figure? Well, Xavier Worthy was seen to be the fastest player in NFL Combine history and promptly was untouched twice on 2 touchdowns. He only touched the ball 3 times. Another theme that happened on Thursday night in Kansas City were the illegal formations, which was also quite wild to see that a Ravens team that normally doesn't make mistakes like this made mistakes like this. 4 of them. Yes, Mr. False Start, aka Juwan Taylor, had several of those and got away with several more, and Steve Spagnuolo got away with a free timeout, but these things tend to happen, and yet Kansas City tends to survive anyway. The Chiefs did their thing once again, and their defense kept Lamar at bay as long as they could. And despite the dominant performance by Isaiah Likely, it was his big toe that kept the Ravens from tying and or winning the game before regulation. And for the second time in a span of 9 months, the Ravens lose a heartbreaker to the Chiefs. Some things never seem to change. Also, Lamar Jackson missing a bunch of passes. That's not great and must change ASAP. The next stop is actually going to be in Brazil. The first NFL game in South America brought us 2 very interesting young QBs from the 2020 class. The last 2 that were drafted from the 2020 class. Jordan Love, I think, played pretty well. Jalen Reed also played pretty well. But the Packers made a bunch of mistakes. And to be honest, this game should have started 14-0 Packers. But instead, the Eagles held firm after the 2 turnovers early and only gave up those field goals. And then Saquon Barkley pulled up. And then Giants fans got in their feelings that they were not having a good time. More on that in a moment. But the Giants would also watch their former best player cook with 3 scores and be as dominant of a player as advertised, as he's always been advertised since his Penn State days. A.J. Brown got in where he fit, and also that was a really nice touchdown catch and run on his part. Now, Jalen Hurts, I never liked him as a passer, and he kind of continues to prove that point. For that A.J. Brown pass and the wheel route pass to Saquon Barkley, he threw 2 innos, and I think he probably should have threw a couple more, one of which should have been taken back to the crib by Keyshawn Nixon. And that holding call on Jair Alexander, devastating towards the end of that game, where it felt like the Packers had a golden opportunity to win that game. That was not great. What was also not great was Jordan Love's injury, and the fact that he's out for a couple weeks is sort of low-key devastating. Can the Packers navigate without him? They obviously couldn't do it for a couple plays. Malik Willis had no shot and didn't attempt to take one towards the end zone. The Eagles escape a game where it felt like if Green Bay got out of the wrong way, they probably would have won. And sometimes you got to win those games like that. Now to the Giants as we take the train to MetLife Stadium, and this game was ugly. And we all thought it would be. But only one team was actually ugly. It would be the home team. Daniel Jones is every bit as bad as we all thought he was, and that pick 6 to Andrew Van Ginkel was so familiar. It's literally the same play that I saw when I was in Washington, or then over Maryland as it were, for that Commanders game, as Van Ginkel was a former Dolphin. So I've seen this before. What's also been seen before is Aaron Jones scoring a rushing touchdown. He had a good day as his debut as a Minnesota Viking. Packer fans are probably not fans of the whole Lambeau Leap thing that he did. That wasn't great. But what was great is Justin Jefferson scoring touches. He did another one. Though Jordan Addison leaving the game was not great. Daniel Jones having more pick 6s than passing touchdowns since that contract was signed is actually hilarious. Anyway, the Giants season can't end fast enough, and they're going to be stuck with Daniel Jones for at least this one. This was not a great game for the Giants as they celebrate their 100th year anniversary with those uniforms that I don't think are that great of a look. That logo was dope, though. I didn't think that it was possible for the Panthers to be worse than it was last year as we take the train to the final stop of this NFL season, being New Orleans. It turns out that this actually might be a worse season than last year was, and last year was brutal. There wasn't much that Carolina did right here. Bryce Young threw several NOs and still didn't look good at all, and New Orleans, who I think is the definition of mid in the NFL this year, looked great. Derek Carr cooked. Alvin Kamara looked a bit like the Kamara that we're used to seeing. The only thing that was really weird for New Orleans is that they hung 47 and Chris Olave only had 11 yards. Then again, that may actually make it really bad that the Panthers actually did something good and still almost gave up a 50-piece. Even worse, Carolina's best player, Derrick Brown, might be out for the season with an injury, and a Panther team that was awful and only won 2 games last year may have it hard to really try to win 2 games even this year. Pain. That name is Carolina. It's also Atlanta, and that's where we're going to take the next stop on this train ride. And for the Falcons to Falcon, it's hard, but sometimes Atlanta makes it an art form. This was a very Steelers game, and a Steelers game where despite the lack of Russell Wilson, knowing full well Justin Fields isn't that great of a passer, he never was, he was actually decent in this game. And he ran for 57 yards, but we knew that was to be expected. Yet, somehow the Steelers ended up winning because TJ Watt was in God mode. And his dominant day was watered down because of a couple of penalties, which makes it terrifying considering how much of a god he tends to be sometimes. Anyway, Kirk Cousins looked awful in this game, and it was not a great day for the Falcons in general. The Steelers shut down Bijan Robinson pretty well. They contained him pretty nicely. None of the receivers really did anything. Ray McLeod actually led the team in receiving at Atlanta, It was not great. The Falcons actually scored a touchdown. The Steelers did not, and Pittsburgh still won by 8. Chris Boswell was the real MVP, not named TJ Watt in the black and gold. Many Steelers fans made that a home game, which in itself is, well, expected because Steelers. Before we head north, we're going to take the train to the most southern destination in the NFL, and that would be Miami. And I'm going to get this out of the way. I think the officers were incredibly excessive. I didn't think there was any need whatsoever to pull Tyreek out of the car like they did and cuff him and treat him as they did. And then apparently, based off the body cam videos, it seemed like they were surprised to realize who that actually was. And after listening to what Tyreek said on CNN earlier tonight, it seems like he didn't want to make a scene. I get why he didn't want to do that. I think that's understandable, though I think Tyreek was a bit stubborn in trying to just ask for the ticket and get out and keep things moving. I just think this was a poorly handled situation, but way more poorly by the officers in question who were there trying to handle the situation. Now let's get to the game itself, and it seemed like for the first half, the Dolphins were flustered. They were unorganized, they seemed to be out of whack, nothing really went right for them. Trevor Lawrence and company actually played a respectable first half, and then the second half happens, and it's an entirely different game. Dolphins played so much better. They were way more organized. Whereas Tua was the guy who organized the team and really got under everyone's skin to say, like, okay, we're better than this. And they proved to be. The Javon Holland peanut punch is one of the defensive plays of the year, and I think we can bookmark that even now. That was that great of a play. Why? The next play, Tyreek Hill goes 80 to the crib, and we really should have seen that arrest celebration coming. We really should have seen it coming. Anyway, the Dolphins dominated the second half of the game. Tua badly outplayed Trevor Lawrence. Miami wins the game by, honestly, being the tougher team, especially in the second half, with critical third down conversions, when 3rd and 1, which is something Miami did not do well last year. And they didn't win a game with a street race. They won it with a street fight kind of mentality. This was a really galvanizing win for Miami, and if this is the Dolphins team we're going to see going forward, they're going to be much better for it. Their next opponent is Buffalo. The next train stop is Orchard Park. And Arizona, and I knew this was coming, that the Cardinals were going to fight some teams. I just didn't think it would be Buffalo necessarily. They looked like the better team Arizona did for, I would say, 2.5 quarters. And then Josh Allen put on the Superman cape and decided to be MVP caliber Josh Allen, as he basically one-man gang carried his team right back into this game and into the lead with not too much time to spare. And I think a play that's going to be maddening for Cardinals fans, Marvin Harrison Jr. was incredibly wide open. The nearest guy that could have covered him on what should have been the game-winning touchdown pass was in Niagara Falls. And not the U.S. side of it. They were in Canada. They needed passports and everything to try to cover Marvin on that touchdown pass that should have been. Instead, it was a check down for Kyler Murray, not a bomb to Marvin Harrison. The Cardinals did not get a second chance to erase that mistake, as Buffalo would close the deal. And the Bills survive and advance with a 1-0 record. Though they did not look great in getting there, they at least got there, and that's what matters. How long will Josh Allen's non-throwing hand injury linger? They did get 4 sacks, though, which is something they're going to need going forward. The next train stop is going to take us to Cincinnati, and we're going to stay in the AFC East, obviously, with New England. This was easily the most shocking result of the day because, let's face it, maybe 3 people thought the Patriots were actually going to win. Cincinnati, I know, doesn't show up for week 1s, but even this is pretty embarrassing. Joe Burrow didn't look great. Jamar Chase didn't look great. It was just an abject disaster from Cincinnati in every way, shape, form, and fashion. New England does have a defense, and I think that's kind of gets overlooked because we all wonder what the Bengals were doing and what they were thinking. But this, even still, should not happen. A team that supposedly has expectations like Cincinnati should not lose to the Patriots no matter what their situation is, unless there's a massive amount of injuries. Now, T. Higgins didn't play, but even still, this should not happen. This is a good day for New England, though. New England does get the wins. They won't go 0-17, which is nice, but it's just a really ugly loss for Cincinnati. And now they're going to Kansas City in week 2, so they're facing the team that we all thought was outhouse in the AFC to the penthouse of the conference. That's not great. The last 2 stops of week 1's Railway Path will take us to other parts of the Midwest. The first being Chicago. And I don't know if this is a strictly Titan game. I don't know what exactly we call this except for Caleb Williams struggling really badly, and yet Tennessee still finding a way to lose. The fact that Tennessee's defense was able to harass Caleb all day and shut down that Bear offense with so many weapons and so much talent all day long and still find a way to lose is really disappointing. That block punt, taken back to the crib by Jonathan Owens, did not help. The awful pick 6 that will lead us through to Tyree Stevenson was also devastating. And all of this really takes away from what was a pretty good day from Tony Pollard. Pollard looked pretty solid, and he ran for 80-plus yards and a score. Yeah, the Will Levis arc is interesting. Sometimes you're going to get the Dr. Jekyll versions. Sometimes you're going to get the Mr. Hydes. This was one of the latter category. He did not look great. And the final stop of the early portion of the Railway Path will take us to Indianapolis, where I thought this would be the game of the day, and it turns out, at least the 1 o'clock portion of it, and it turns out it was. The Colts and Texans, if there's anything I've learned from this, I believe it's that these 2 QBs and these 2 teams potentially are going to terrorize the AFC South for the next decade. CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson both look very productive. Richardson only completed 9 passes, which is really wild. One of which being a beautiful dime to Alec Pierce, which is a long touchdown. That ball really did travel 65 yards in the air, which is crazy. As much as that's going to dominate highlights for many days and moons and nights to come, Stroud played really well as well. Stephon Diggs and Joe Mixon both played well in their debuts as Houston Texans. And that catch by Nico Collins at the end to seal it was incredible stuff. This was a fun game and a fun back-and-forth battle, and potentially, honestly, I think these are going to be the 2 teams that dominate this division for a while to come. Great win for Houston. Indy, there's no shame. I do think the Colts are going to be fine and still remain very solid playoff contenders. Now to the late game portion of the Railway Pass for Week 1, and we're going to go to Cleveland and get this out of the way because this was ugly. What was I thinking picking the Browns to win this game? Deshaun Watson was awful. And yeah, I think maybe the Houston Deshaun Watson is dead and buried, and he's not coming back. And now there's a new allegation that just resurfaced earlier today. That's an awful look. What was also awful was that Dak Prescott did whatever he wanted to the Browns defense. Cleveland really had no answers for Prescott and anything he wanted to do. They had no answers for the Dallas defense, which was able to get after Deshaun Watson and cause havoc and chaos and turnovers. It was a disastrous home opener for the Browns, who really had nothing they could offer the Cowboys to try to hinder them whatsoever. This game was over after halftime, and it felt like the second half was window dressing. Dallas could have probably hung a clean 50 on them if they really, really wanted to, and they opted not to. That's really disappointing for a Browns defense that was awesome and seen as the best defense in the league last year. Deshaun Watson's best days are behind him, and that's really bad for the Browns. We're going to take the train south to Tampa Bay before we head west. And when it comes to this game, we probably should have seen it coming. We should have seen it coming that Jalen Daniels would take some time to really get right and be efficient as a quarterback. To be fair, he was. He just didn't get the ball in the end zone through the air. He did score twice on the ground and almost had 90 yards rushing. We should have seen coming that Dan Quinn and the Commander defense would take some time to get used to each other. And they needed it. Baker Mayfield was dialed in. His receivers were dialed in. 4 touchdown passes from Baker. He was generally awesome. The Bucs actually ran the ball at a decent rate with Bucky Irving, who looked pretty productive when he had the rock in his hands. Rachaad White did not look great, even though the Commander's front line is nasty and is like that. Death taxes and Mike Evans balling out. Mike Evans had another good game. He scored twice. Chris Godwin played well. Tampa Bay rolled in this game, and despite only winning 37-20, it felt like it probably could have been worse had Tampa kept the foot on the gas a little bit longer. Now we're going to take the train west. First to Seattle. And this game was as wild and as goofy as most Broncos games tend to be over the last 3 years. The Broncos really had 2 safeties in this game. Bo Nix threw 2 Innos in this game. And the Innos obviously outweighed the safeties because Seattle punished Denver after the Innos. The safeties were wild though. One of which the special teams forced, one was forced on a penalty via holding. But one thing that was not wild, one thing that we could rely on, is that Seattle could run the ball fairly well. Kenneth Walker was balling out until he got hurt. Zach Charbonnet got in where he fit in and had a good receiving touchdown. Geno Smith somehow got the seas parted, and he had a 30-yard rushing touchdown. And Seattle was able to handle business because of their ability to run the rock and to stop the run. Javonte Williams was a non-factor in this game. For that matter, it didn't feel like Courtland Sutton was much of one either, and that's a little disappointing. A lot of top receivers did not have good games in Week 1. I don't think that's going to stick, but it is a little surprising to see that. In the Commander game, for example, Terry McLaurin only had 2 catches, and it was not great. Anyway, Seattle gets it done. Seattle looked somewhat respectable. Bo Nix was not very accurate at all, which was not great to see. And the Seahawks get it done. And Denver, I think, is going to be okay, but they've got a lot to do, and this Steeler game for Week 2 is going to probably be gross. Let's go down to California and let's deal with the Chargers-Raiders game. And this game was as physical as you probably would expect from a Jim Harbaugh team. The Chargers could all of a sudden run the ball and run it pretty well. J.K. Dobbins looked rejuvenated. That's good to see. Gus Edwards looked okay. Good to see. Justin Herbert didn't do too much. And at the same time, he didn't have to. And it's because of how great that run game was. Now, Herbert did throw a touchdown pass. Welcome to the league, Ladd McConkey, as he caught said touchdown pass, which is good to see. And the Chargers, edge rushers, the high-priced ones, did what they were supposed to. Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack combined to 2.5 sacks. Mack had the extra half. And they caused turnovers and havoc for the Raiders all day long. Great work by the Charger defense, which is saying something considering they had a defensive coach over the last few years who didn't prove to be all that great. Anyway, they made Gardner Minshew look pretty mundane and average, and the Chargers were able to win a game relatively easily, to be honest. It didn't feel like for a lot of this game that they were going to ever lose it. And now we're going to take the train to Detroit for the Sunday night game. And this game was fun. It was entertaining, it was back and forth, and we should have seen it coming, and we should have expected it. The injuries to the Rams really were the undoing here, and it's unfortunate to see that. The offensive line was absolutely ravaged by injuries, and the Lions pass rush was able to really feast when the injuries came up. Alex Anzalone was a maniac. He was all over the place. That first drive alone should have told us that Alex Anzalone was going to have a big night, and he did. It was a good day for Jahmyr Gibbs and for David Montgomery of the Lions, but Jameson Williams showing up and showing out, and everyone want to see if he can break out. If this is the first sign of it, then Detroit's going to be terrifying, because now you got two legit number one receivers that can be devastating at any given moment, plus two number one running backs, plus a excellent tight end, Sam Laporta. It becomes a nasty situation with an offensive line that is basically a moving brick wall. That's not great. Meanwhile, the Rams, Matt Stafford looked good. Kyren Williams looked good. Cooper Kupp looked good. Puka Nacua, when he was playing, also looked good, but Nacua's going to be out for a month, which is not great for fantasy teams, mine included. Anyway, the Rams winning this game will be big for tiebreakers later on, because I think the Rams are still going to be fine. And to the Rams' credit, they hung around for a lot of this game and just didn't get the ball in overtime, which I think is a rule that should stick. I'm okay with the overtime rules. Let's not change them just because the Rams didn't get the ball. It's not necessary. Detroit was the better team. Defense matters. The Rams couldn't play it in OT. Perfectly fine. There's good news and bad news for the Jets as we make our final stop in this railway path in Santa Clara. First, the good. Aaron Rodgers played the entire game. He had that great drive in the third quarter where he got the ball down the field to Allen Lazard for that touchdown. And it's kind of weird that Allen Lazard in 2024 actually looked competent and looked good, considering he did not his first year as a Jet. Then there's the bad news. There was no Christian McCaffrey, and they gave up 180 yards rushing. 147 of them belong to CMC's backup in Jordan Mason, whom I'm very sure as of this moment in time, there are people running to their computers or phones or tablets looking for Jordan Mason to pick up on their fantasy teams, just in case CMC can't play going forward. The Madden curse might be real. Anyway, I gotta be honest, I think Aaron Rodgers is Justin Verlander, and this is Mets Verlander, not the Tigers or the Astros Verlander. Mets Verlander was older, and he got the injuries early, and he was mediocre at best, and then he ended up in Houston before August. And the Astros ended up back in the ALCS, and Verlander suddenly looked kind of sort of like he used to. Rodgers tonight was mediocre at best, to be honest, and I think, is this a sign of things to come? Maybe. I would lean towards yes, but obviously we'll see. He had that one good drive with the touchdown to Lazard on the free play, because of course he did. And I think the Jets are kind of in for a rude awakening, because I don't think he's the guy that they believe he is. In truth, the Niners outclassed them. The Niners outmatched them. And they made the Jets tap out with 5 minutes to go and say, you know what, we're just going to move on to the next game. That's saying something. Yikes. The Niners are like that. The Jets are not, no matter how much their fans will tell you that they are. So week one's in the books, and that was the final stop of this railway path. I went 11-5 overall. Tomorrow will come the power rankings. Who will go into what tier after week one and leading into week two? Carolina and the New York Giants are going to lead off the bottom tier. That will be the first stop of my next train of thought.